Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Will Pharmacists Adopt New Vancomycin Guidelines, presented by InsightRX. I'm Michael Shashua, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Just a few technical notes before we begin. The webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please make sure your volume is up. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. Time permitting, we will follow the presentations with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions using the Questions and Answers tab on the left side of your screen. So now let's begin. I'm going to turn it over to Dan D'Orazio, CEO of Sage Growth Partners, who will also introduce the other panelists. Dan?
Michael, thank you very much. Thank you to all the attendees who are joining today for this very important topic, and thank you to Fierce Healthcare for being our gracious host. I have a really great panel today to discuss this really important clinical and business discussion around vancomycin. And I'm happy to introduce our panelists briefly, and then we're going to jump into hopefully what is a live discussion. First, I'd like to introduce Sirj Goswami, who's the CEO and co-founder of InsightRX. Sirj received his PhD from the Department of Bioengineering and Therapeutic Sciences with a research focus in genomics, pharmacokinetics, and pharmacometrics. He brings the genomics and advanced analysis to the forefront of healthcare. I think you'll really appreciate the forward thinking of Sirj and how they're tackling this important issue. Rita is principal of RKJ Health Partners, where she provides consultative services in pharmacy operations, medication safety, pharmacy finance, specialty pharmacy, sterile compounding, and extemporaneous formulation. She held various leadership positions, which is really key today. We're going to talk about leadership at the Children's Hospital and Health Systems, Children's Hospitals and Health System pharmacies, and received her PharmD from the University of California at San Francisco. Julie Giddens is an infectious disease pharmacy coordinator for OSF Healthcare, which is a 14-facility health system in Peoria, Illinois, and she holds a PharmD from Purdue University. She, along with Jeff Laux, are going to provide really great insights about what's happening, in practice. And Jeff is a clinical pharmacy specialist with an emphasis in critical care and infectious disease antimicrobial stewardship at Covenant Healthcare in Saginaw, Michigan, and he received his bachelor's from Ferris State University in Big Rapids, Michigan, and his Doctor of Pharmacy from Northern Ohio University in Ohio. So again, great panel. Really appreciate all of you joining today for this really important discussion. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Sirj for just a few comments.
Thank you, Dan. So I will start off with a little bit of context here. The new vancomycin consensus guidelines are basically an evolution of the previous ones that were published in 2009. And in 2009, the recommendation was to target steady state trough concentration between 15 and 20. So over the past decade or so, there have been several published articles that concluded that instead of trough-based dosing, AUC-based dosing may be a better way to dose patients, both in terms of maximizing the antibiotic's efficacy, but also in terms of minimizing the risk of nephrotoxicity. So in March of 2020, the new consensus vancomycin dosing guidelines were published and endorsed by 4 major societies, including the American Society of Health System Pharmacists, the Infectious Disease Society of America, Society of Infectious Diseases Pharmacists, and the Pediatric Infectious Disease Society. The guidelines were published predominantly on the basis of safety, and the primary recommendation is to transition from trough-based dosing to AUC-based dosing. And in particular, an AUC target of 400 to 600 is what was recommended for both adults and pediatrics, although for pediatrics suggested to err closer on the side of 400. The recommendations are, however, limited to the Staph aureus pathogen. Other bacteria were not included due to insufficient evidence. There are a few additional recommendations in the guidelines that I want to point out. The first is that it's recommended that concentration levels should be attained as soon as possible, ideally in the first 24 to 48 hours. And secondly, because there are a few different methodologies and calculators to estimate area under the curve, the authors do go on to recommend the use of a Bayesian methodology as a preferred approach to achieve target AUC levels. So now with the guidelines published, many hospitals and health systems are assessing whether or not to make the transition from trough to AUC-based dosing. And for the sites that do want to make a transition, there are a number of outstanding questions related to selecting the right methodology, the right software tools, implementation processes, and even demonstrating a return on investment. So I'm very much looking forward to exploring some of these topics with the panelists today.
Great, thank you, Sirj. Really helpful. And so to unpack this important question, we started off with InsightRX tackling some of those questions that Sirj just shared to understand market perceptions and feedback. And so we surveyed pharmacist reactions to the guidelines and their implementation plans in light of the pandemic as well, because a lot has changed. So around the time that the consensus guidelines come out, of course, we have the challenges of COVID. Operating in healthcare is difficult on any given day, and I think it's fair to say the last 6 months have been among the most challenging in our lifetime, certainly that many of us have experienced. So we really wanted to get that insight of the market, and so we spoke with 120 respondents, both pharmacists and pharmacy leaders. And I think we have some really interesting insights, some of which we're going to share, which will help lead to some of our discussion. So the great news is that pharmacy leaders widely believe that the guidelines will benefit patients, which is incredibly important. We continue to learn about just the challenge and importance of patient safety, but we also know that change and change management in healthcare is challenging, to say the least. It's very complicated, lots of humans involved, lots of different systems, and at a time where we see the increasing amount of technology being available, that it doesn't always mean it's easy. And so we really wanted to unpack this question of what's happening with adoption and why, how people are thinking about the guidelines and what it means to move to, the AUC and the Bayesian methodology. And so from an overwhelming perspective, 98% of the respondents believe the guidelines are varied as somewhat important to patient care and clinical practice. And maybe surprising, maybe not surprising, we'll get into that. The overwhelming majority are currently using the trough-based dosing methodology. And so while we might we've had some hunches about that, we started to probe a little bit more about where people's minds are on, shifting to the AUC-guided dosing of vancomycin. And so there's a number of folks who are in the 31% that said, hey, we're moving forward with this. But there's a whole, the overwhelming majority of folks, 60%, who are still looking at this, trying to figure it out, and perhaps on the fence, trying to fully understand this. Hopefully that's part of why you're joining us today. And, a very small percentage of the respondents who said that they weren't going to do it. So with that, what we thought we would do is get some live feedback from the audience. Now that the guidelines have been out, perhaps you've learned more about it, and we want to get a sense of if your hospital and health systems plan to shift to the AUC-guided dosing of vancomycin. And please take some time right now. It'd be great to see your feedback, and it'll help our discussion. So take a few minutes and submit those answers, and we'll take a look at live what we see. Just give it about a few more seconds here. Great. And so this is really helpful. I think it confirms some of what we saw in the research a little earlier. Maybe a few more folks on this call than a few months ago planning to adopt. Still a number of folks trying to figure out what this really means, and we really hope to shed light on that in today's discussion with our panelists, and we'll get to them shortly. And so we asked folks well, let me go back a second here. I want to talk about the results for just a minute. So, starting with Jeff and Julie, your health system adopted the AUC guided dosing and Bayesian software in particular before the guidelines were published, and really curious how you got buy-in from the pharmacist and the leadership to go ahead with that decision to adopt the guidelines, even far in advance of the publication and the consensus guidelines. So Julie, I'll throw that over to you first.
Yes, Dan, thank you. So pharmacy was asked to assess the use of Bayesian software in reducing AKI OSF healthcare system. What I found initially was that a lot of the facilities did not believe that they had a problem with AKI rates with vancomycin. So what we really needed to do first was figure out our baseline AKI rates to set up the platform for change. Once we did that, we did show that we did have a problem with AKI, and we were able to set that platform up and able to justify AUC dosing, particularly Bayesian software with a platform that was able to integrate into Epic.
Thank you. So Julie, I think just if I can go off that for a second, you talked about the importance of actually demonstrating that AKI is a challenge. And by no means, I'm sure, did people sit around and point fingers, but it could be, a difficult topic to shine the light on. I'm just curious how that played out in your organization when you maybe had a sense that there was a problem and you knew it more definitively.
Yes. So initially, providers were a little reluctant to change. They were thinking that we were going to do potentially more aggressive dosing. They were worried that actually we would increase our AKI rates if we changed to AUC. There were some thoughts in some facilities that they already have really good AKI rates, so they don't really need to make any change. We found out that some facilities were not measuring AKI rates correctly. They weren't using the KDIGO guidelines. So once we found all this out, we started making sure that we were measuring all the same way. We spoke with providers and kind of explained how AUC dosing worked. We were able to get better buy-in.
Yeah, okay, that's really helpful. Jeff, I think from your perspective, in some of our discussions, from the point of view of the clinical side, it was fairly understood and well accepted. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Pretty much have been following the AUC dosing coming for a while, going to conferences like MAD-ID, ACCP, conferences like that, and they had been talking about this coming. And I'm lucky enough, I'm fairly close to Mike Ryback, Jason Pogue in my area, so I kind of hear them quite a bit and talk with them. And so I knew this was kind of coming, and I could see that the dosing AUC looked to be maybe a better dosing, a better way to go about it than just using the trough, which is what we were using to try to get that same AUC. We knew that we were kind of going and making judgments sometimes on the dosing based on that trough, and we didn't know if we were doing a good job or not. We were using a spreadsheet that kind of empirically started the dose. So I went to one of the conferences and actually talked with Jason Pogue and kind of found out how they were doing it with the 2-level dosing in a spreadsheet. And it looked like we were going to get better outcomes. And plus they published their literature where at the Detroit Medical Center, they showed by doing this that they were getting lower AKIs and actually using less vancomycin. So we knew that this was going to be coming, and we just didn't know how we were going to go about doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's helpful. I mean, right, the scalability ultimately becomes part of the question. I think, Jeff, you'll talk a little later just about how the volume of this, and be curious to see how the scalability and efficiency plays out. Rita, from your perspective, you've been in that seat of an administrator, and you've seen lots of different innovations come, some go, some get adopted, some more or less than others. As you look at this step forward, I'm curious, from an administrator's view, how you view this kind of consensus guidelines and what it means and what people should think about.
Well, I think sure. I think the most important thing is to identify your champion and your stakeholders. It will be very helpful to have a pharmacy champion in this case, obviously, since we're talking about vancomycin. And in this, I think at this stage in healthcare system, almost everybody has an antimicrobial stewardship program, and engaging that stakeholders in that program is probably the first thing folks need to be doing to try to be the champion to push this forward. I think back when I was at UCSF, we were lucky. We were actually testing out a Bayesian-based software, and we were lucky to have a champion in the pharmacy, a PCID pharmacist who's very interested in the process. And when you have someone who is excited about this and interested in that, then they really work very well to basically help work through some of the barriers for the frontline staff. What are some of the issues when they're trying to practically use the program and trying to make sense of it, to working through with IT folks and the vendors to kind of remove those barriers. And also just the very simple thing, knowing that change is hard for a lot of people, being able to work on developing training and conducting those training and encouraging folks. I have to say that our ID specialists literally will periodically publish something in our newsletter to let people know what's going on, what are some of the challenges are, and being really the cheerleader in the process is what is needed to try to move things like this forward.
Yeah. That's helpful. Rita, I think that dovetails really well with the next slide here, and understanding some of the challenges facing the pharmacy department in your hospital, and there are any number of them. And so when you think about the leadership and what they're confronting, both in the pharmacy but also in the larger strategic orientation of the hospital, we start to see, at least from this data, where the guidelines fit in. I think the interesting thing is, how do we, Rita, you just talked about that champion, how do we arm the folks who want to move this forward with the right insights? And should we just take this on face value that precision dosing, is further down the list? And what does that mean for the movement of precision dosing?
Sure. Well, I think as this is the slide that you're showing is typical of every day what we're facing. I mean, with COVID, the budget issues definitely pop up to the top, and we're dealing with drug shortages and drug costs all the time. So I think it is important to kind of step back a little and look at this from the holistic perspective of what can this precision dosing program, like if you're going to move forward with trying to do AUC dosing for vancomycin and try to adopt a Bayesian-based software, what is the advantages of that, and how does that link it back into the most important things? I think this slide is great to show folks what the administrators are thinking and trying to think of more like thinking like they do. And so how do you apply some of these things? How does the program impact some of these most important things that they're thinking in their head? And I would say that we know that from some experience from others that by using the Bayesian modeling and dosing by AUC, you can potentially decrease the use of vancomycin. That will also decrease. Yeah. So solve some of your problems with drug shortages, decrease drug costs. But then I think the more important thing is if we are all going to eventually go into this following these guidelines and using AUC to dose vancomycin. And if you're doing it manually, it's going to take a significant amount of time. So that affects staffing, that affects all the workforce issues that you see on this slide. So I think it's really leveraging on some of these important things and trying to, that is in the top of the head of administrators and trying to think about what can this program impact some of these big things. And I would say that it definitely can decrease clinicians' time and all.
Yeah. Jeff, what's your experience been around how this fits into this larger stack of competing priorities?
We pretty much, our hospital follows almost what you're seeing on this slide. You'd probably answer the question pretty much the same way. So you look at it from a kind of a clinical standpoint. From the pharmacy, I mean, we have to look at how much Vanco we're using, how well we're using it, what are our outcomes, even to the point of how many levels are we drawing? Are we having to repeat levels? And these are all costs that, we as a clinical pharmacist don't think about it, but it all came into play as we took a look at this. Pretty much on a daily basis, we probably average at least 30 to 40 patients that are on Vanco at our institution. So it takes a pretty large chunk of time to take a look at the dosing each day. And we were always dosing almost all our patients. We didn't leave any out in dose by nomograms. So it took a long time, so we wanted to keep that into consideration as we looked at which direction we were going to go. Did we want to put in information into a spreadsheet and draw two levels, or did we want to try to do a Bayesian approach where maybe we could integrate into our system the information and use it that way, and possibly lower the amount of hands-on work that we had to do and spend more time with the clinical thought process instead of putting information in. So that's kind of how we went about looking at it.
Yeah. Okay. So productivity became an important part of that, which I think covers a number of these key areas. Rita, as an administrator, you probably got lots of requests, and you also had to advocate sort of up the chain as well. From a budgeting and stakeholder process, any thoughts or recommendations if we've got folks sitting on the call and they really believe in this and they need some of that inside baseball to help move this forward from an administrator's view?
Sure. Well, I think, so for example, if you can demonstrate that it's going to take less time for your clinical staff to use a software to do the AUC dosing, it can increase their productivity. That's maybe you don't need to hire as many staff, or maybe you can accomplish some of the important projects that folks can be doing that it's high on the priority. But I think the other big thing is to really look at the quality of patient care. Everybody believes in that, obviously. Those of us who go into healthcare always think about patient care at the first and foremost. So demonstrating, having that baseline information on AKI and demonstrating that with what is the current state will help justify the budget. I think in the long run, this is, while trying to get a software is not cheap, it's also not the most expensive thing for the pharmacy department, right? Especially when you compare it to automation and other things. So trying to compare that also, and how your return on investment in this technology versus automation, for example, how does that compare, is going to be something that you will want to do to try to basically appeal to your administration. So, and I think the other important thing too is to understand what the priorities are in the department, because if you have certain priorities in the department that is in line, if patient safety is high on the list, then I would definitely say that use that as your justification for buying into the software.
Yeah, it really makes sense. I mean, every hospital has, they wake up every day and patient safety is why everyone shows up. But obviously there's lots of intervening factors. And it sort of gets to our next question in the survey, the actual reduction in AKI, but also what does that mean financially? Of course, healthcare is the largest part of our economy. It's $3 trillion and growing. And that pressure eventually comes from the payers to the hospitals. And in times of COVID, of course, everyone's been feeling that pressure. So it's hard to separate the discussion of both clinical and finance. And so what I want to do is tackle the clinical benefit here, we see that about 76% of respondents believe that the Bayesian approach will reduce AKI more than the manual approach, either much less, people believe much less or somewhat less with Bayesian compared to manual. I'm curious, Julie, what actually happened at OSF around the AKI experience and reductions that you might have seen?
Yes, we actually initially saw a reduction of 30% from 19% to 14%. We still, as we change our protocols around and align more with the 2020 guidelines that were released in March, will experience or have experienced further reduction.
And how was that? I'm curious how that was received. We talked earlier about how shining the light on that might be difficult, but what was the reaction from that 19 to 14%?
Yes, so the reaction was one of that it allowed us to continue on utilizing the Bayesian platform and not having to go to a manual entry because like Jeff, we also wanted to avoid having to enter a manual, increase our pharmacist workload and time, as well as our institutions are not very good at ordering peaks and troughs at specific times, which is what's needed for the trapezoidal method, and so we wanted to avoid that as well. So having this reduction really helped us to solidify our need to continue with this methodology.
Yeah, that's great. Jeff, how about you guys from that clinical perspective?
This is Jeff. We were having a hard time looking and finding our AKI rates, actually. Hate to say it, but we really did not know how well or how bad we were doing. We had a hard time pulling data out, especially using, we didn't have the information in Epic to actually pull out. So it took us, we couldn't really tell how well we were doing or not so well, they say. So when we were looking at the different platforms, we actually finally got our analysis team together to pull data out and send it to Insight, and they did some number crunching for us and actually compared what we were doing prior to a time frame prior to implementation of Insight and doing the Bayesian, and we saw our AKI rates going down. We had a little blip with some stage 1 KDIGO area, but across the board, except for that, we were down on our AKI rates, and overall we were down. Our no-risk area is actually up quite a bit. So just by looking at that, it gave us a little bit information that helps us show that we're actually seeing an improvement in what we're doing.
Okay, really helpful. Sirj, I'm sure you get this question all the time. How do I know how do I pay for this? Is there an ROI? Right, this is the business side of people. A lot of people probably want this, but how do you deal with that ROI discussion? What have you seen?
Absolutely. So, to take a step back, it is part of our standard customer success process to look at different clinical metrics that would indicate how well the Bayesian methodology is performing, and also how well the model-informed precision dosing platform is working overall. And as part of this reporting mechanism that was touched upon by both Jeff and Julie, we do look at a few things. We look at AUC target attainment, but we also look at the incidence of acute kidney injury, and when possible, we ask that hospitals provide baseline metrics directly to compare against. So from our experience to date, we consistently see anywhere from a 30 to 50% improvement in severe acute kidney injury. And we also perform Dan, to your point, a ROI analysis based on the severe AKI reduction, and that usually comes out to be about 5x. But that said, we do recognize that the cost savings, right, from AKI reduction don't necessarily go back to the pharmacy department. The overall hospital is benefiting. So I personally would be curious to learn from Rita. You did a really nice job earlier describing the budgeting process and getting stakeholder buy-in, but who are the specific, from your perspective, who are the specific stakeholders within a hospital that should hear about the clinical benefit, but also the financial benefit to AUC-based dosing?
Sure. Well, definitely the C-suites, right? I mean, those are the things that is top on their mind, the quality of care that we're providing. So I think this is, again, going back to identifying who your potential stakeholders could be. And while the ID physicians are natural people to turn to, you got to think about other people who might be very interested in this kind of improving this outcome. I would say that your first other set of group of people you wanted to turn to are the nephrologists, right? And maybe even your critical care folks to really look at the big picture, and then look at. It is true that a lot of these cost savings is not going back to the pharmacy, but at the end of the day, we all look at the holistic picture of the entire hospital. So if we know that we can bring value to improving patient care, even though it might cost us a little bit of money to buy software, for example, I think folks can see that if there is really a 5X return on investment, then it is something that is worthwhile to do. So I think sometimes it's really also getting your physician champion to kind of speak to that, and then you look at the costs that is entailed in the length of stay, a reduction in length of stay, or just the cost itself per day, because we all know most of our contracts these days are per diem, at the per diem rate. If a patient ended up came in with sepsis, ended up on CRRT, is going to dramatically increase the cost. So by avoiding having the patient go on CRRT, for example, will be something that is definitely what people would want to achieve. So really thinking about this in the bigger picture and recruiting a champion from the different departments, especially a physician champion, will be helpful. And in this case, sometimes you can probably also document some cost savings in reducing lab utilization by reducing the number of drug levels that you need to be getting if you can have a more efficient program in place.
Yeah. Great discussion. In our experience, the health economics and the ROI part of this has to really be attended to. It's not the kind of thing we should shrink away from. So that becomes really important. When we talked to the market, we wanted to get a sense of. It was clear that a lot of people believe in the guidelines and the power of the appropriate methodologies, and curious to see how many people thought that there was vancomycin-induced AKI, and is this a problem? And I think where the market came out on this, will be interested to get some feedback here, is that about close to 60% of the market didn't believe that this was a real big challenge for them. So it'd be great to hear from folks here and understand if your pharmacy measures AKI rates at the hospital. Just trying to understand, if you're using the KDIGO or another method. So please take a few minutes, and we'd love that feedback for discussion. Great. Just give it another second here. So we've got about 20% using the KDIGO guidelines, and a number of folks, a majority of folks who are not measuring AKI, which is part of what we discussed earlier with Jeff and others about, do we really know where this stands? And so I think this begs the question of what access does pharmacy have on Vanco-associated AKIs? How easy is this to measure? And for folks who want to do this, what step could they take forward? And I'll throw that over to you, Julie, in terms of how you approach this and the importance of this.
Yes, so we had to involve our data analytics as well as assistants that that we had through Insight, and using the KDIGO criteria, we were able to do our baseline and then our post monitoring, and now we actually monitor AKI rates of vancomycin monthly, which has been very helpful as we were able to drill down into the data to see if we've had jumps in our AKI rates post implementation. We actually saw in May where we did have an increase in AKI rates, and that just we were able to note that coincided with our furloughs due to COVID and decreased staffing issues, and we were able to show that to administration. So it has been super helpful to know what our rates are and to follow them on a monthly basis.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, that's real-time information that's probably helping to drive that care improvement. Thank you for sharing that COVID example. How about you, Jeff?
We're very similar to that. I think we didn't have it, like I talked about earlier. We didn't have the information, and now we are being able to see it and see how we're improving. One thing that always seems to come about, we talked earlier, stakeholders, the nephrologists are the first ones to call out the Vanco. It doesn't matter if there are other measures that are going on with the patient, but once Vanco's on, it seems to always cause nephrotoxicity no matter what. So being able to show this sometimes, and show that we it's not always Vanco that's going on, it's very helpful for us, and it's what we've been doing so far.
Mm-hmm. Great. Rita, what is this data question probably comes up all the time as a leader and an administrator, and do we have the data? Should we get the data? It's sort of an age-old challenge that everybody faces because, of course, we don't have perfect data liquidity in healthcare. We're still improving a lot there. What's the typical kind of data that's available, and how would you see this kind of data helping our champions?
Sure. Well, I would argue that the raw data is readily available to everyone, right? I mean, you look at the KDIGO guidelines, you're talking about monitoring serum creatinine and urine output, and those data are all in our electronic medical records right now. I think the difficulty is to try to pull that data to identify patients with AKI, right? And I think that becomes a really manual process if you don't have any software that can help you measure those. And I think that's really where the rubber meets the road, because I recall that we actually did try to capture that with our vancomycin at one point, and it took our pharmacists weeks and months to come up with that data. So I would say the raw data is there. The question is, it's just like with a lot of things in today's healthcare world, we know the data is embedded in the electronic medical records. The question is, how do you get that out of the record and make it meaningful for folks? So that's where utilizing software will be a lot more
really
less
helpful.
labor intensive.
Yeah, not easy. Sirj, you guys are dealing with this question all the time about data and the access to data and analytics. And the power of, I think, what Julie described, sort of that continuous learning. Curious what you guys see when you approach your partners around this key issue.
Absolutely, and I want to mention that despite the empirical evidence supporting the new dosing guidelines to potentially reduce AKI rates, I do really fundamentally think it's important to determine if there is a problem at your institution before trying to fix it. And, part of the issue is, Julie pointed out earlier, might be difficulty in reporting, right? From our perspective, it's important to have a system in place that allows the hospital to not just collect the right data, which for the purposes of an AKI calculation requires serum creatinine data, but secondly, also to use the right methodology to calculate AKI. So the KDIGO guidelines is what we would recommend and is well supported by the literature. So once you establish a baseline in terms of AKI rates and then incorporated precision dosing software at your hospital, it's just as important from our perspective to track these clinical metrics over time. So compared to baseline, has pharmacokinetic target attainment improved? Compared to baseline, has AKI rates gone down. So we've been conscious about this need from the beginning to bundle analytics with precision dosing so that hospitals can get a good understanding of the AKI problem from the get-go, but then also have the ability to track the improvement over time as well. The other point I want to make here, and Dan, you mentioned continuous learning, the analytics and the underlying data for us also serves an additional purpose, which is to make the underlying pharmacokinetic models more predictive for your patient population. So as the predictiveness of the underlying model improve, AUC target attainment is expected to improve, and then the resulting AKI rates are theoretically expected to go down. So although, overall, although the clinical evidence from literature supports AUC-based dosing, I do agree with the statement that it's important to assess the extent of the problem at each specific institution, track the metrics over time, and then have the right tools in place to further improve on those metrics.
Yeah, Sirj, I want to press on that analytics word a little more. A little bit of the skeptic in me, and a lot of people, we've had a lot of promises of analytics. What does it really mean with the work you're doing with your partners, and how does it truly change what they're doing? I mean, there's clearly, when you look at data and surveys, everyone wants analytics. It's hard for people to often get analytics that mean something that could lead to changes in performance. And what I like to say is, it's not just good enough to quote unquote admire the problem. It has to really help you do something. And so can you talk a little bit more about what analytics really means with the partners you work with? Because I think there's a fair dose of skepticism, and love to hear how you guys have made that work.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the purpose of the analytics platform for us is to really assess the problem from the get-go and then track the improvements over time. So in the case for the vancomycin AUC-based dosing guidelines, if the institution wants to implement a dosing software that's driven by the Bayesian methodology, you might want to initially assess how well you're doing with respect to AKI rates. You might want to assess how well you're doing with respect to AUC target attainment. And then once you implement the software, we need to periodically assess how well the software is doing, how well the Bayesian approach is doing in comparison to what the institution was doing before. So it really is a very valuable platform to assess the change that's being implemented at the institution. In this case, the change is towards AUC-based dosing, and then one level deeper from that, it's a change in terms of shifting into a Bayesian methodology to calculate AUC.
Yeah, great. Appreciate that. Change management's hard anywhere. It's really hard in healthcare. It could be a significant barrier to adoption in many technologies that we see. And so when we think about what people are currently using, there's a lot of professional judgment, manual calculations, some solutions by non-EHR providers, but overwhelmingly estimation and professional judgment. Once the decision is made to get to AUC dosing, what do pharmacy departments need to do to ensure success? And this actually ties in with a customer question I'd like you guys to hit. It was around how long did it really take to get your pharmacy colleagues up to speed or fully educated or fully bought in? I think that's a really important part of this change management decision. Even Julie and Jeff, you guys were a little early on this ride, but I'm sure you had to convince others. And Sirj and Rita, I think that's an important question for the audience. So I'm curious, in order to get that broad adoption from pharmacy, especially where there's new protocols, how do you do that? Julie, can you talk about that implementation process and what led to success?
Yes. So we started looking into this in April of 2019. And then through that time, we developed a protocol that would go along with the AUC dosing and be something that our pharmacists could follow. We did training for all of our pharmacists. We did several pilot studies with our protocol to see if it would be reasonable, to see if it's feasible for the pharmacists, as well as if it gave us us the outcomes that we wanted. And then we implemented in August and then 2019. And then even after that, we were doing feedback surveys every month with our pharmacists to see what changes we would need to make to the protocol. And we did those changes all the way up to January. And then we started in our maintenance phase and doing surveys to see how that was going and then making any further changes as needed.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I mean, it was a really rich process for you guys, right? It wasn't just, hey, hope this thing works and then, you know, hold your breath, right? There was buy-in and you kept testing it along the way, it sounds like.
Correct.
Yeah. How about you, Rita, from a software perspective? You've seen other changes come?
Yeah, definitely. When we talk about computer software, I totally agree with Julie that the constant check-in and trying to make changes to enhance the process as you find the barriers and all is all important components. But I think what sometimes I'm hearing people would say too is that, well, you know, when we use these programs, it took away our professional judgment, and I think that's an important thing to address with staff as well, because especially the clinical staff feels like, you know, are you just going to replace me with a program, right? And I think this is where I would argue that, you know, having the program to give you the data can really help you use your professional judgment. You know, if you stay around in pharmacy long enough, you'll realize that things goes in circles. When I first started a long time ago, which I won't tell you how long ago, we were actually doing peak and trough levels of vancomycin and actually doing pharmacokinetics calculations to figure out the volume of distribution, clearance, and all those kind of fun stuff to then come up with the right dosing adjustment for our patients. And that's where we really use a lot of our clinical judgment, looking at the kinetics parameters and seeing that if it even makes sense to try to then decide how to make the changes, or do you need to draw a different level because you don't believe that the volume distribution is actually 5 times higher than the normal population volume distribution. So that gives us a lot of rich data. So I actually had a hard time adjusting to just a trough concentration draw only, because there you really can't do any calculations. That is exactly like it becomes an estimation and there's not a lot of information you're getting. I would argue that with really trying to help clinical staff understand that by using a Bayesian program, you can actually go back to using your clinical judgment, looking at the parameters that is calculated for you in those programs, and then make the best professional judgment on your dosing rather than the estimation that most people are thinking about.
Yeah, Rita, that's really helpful. I think in many cases the technology wasn't there to maybe make this so feasible, and I think that's one of the important advancements here that we're talking about today, which
exactly.
From what I'm hearing everyone say, can make professional judgment even sharper and more satisfying. Mm-hmm. Jeff, what about your team, the change management piece, the before and the after?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of tag on to what Rita was just saying there, especially about the clinical judgment. I mean, no matter what you're doing here, that doesn't go away. I mean, none of the programs, spreadsheets, or any of the modeling programs that use the Bayesian dosing, they're not perfect. Not everybody's the same. And so we actually had a patient this morning that we find that patients that are paralyzed or quadriplegics don't follow well. And so we have to kind of step back and take everything into consideration when we're doing the dosing. So the clinical judgment stays there. It never goes away. When we first started, we had to educate the pharmacists, and we had to tell them why we were doing this. Why do the AUC? Why can't we just stay with what we're doing and, tell them? And the same thing kind of went with the physicians. And what I found is really the physicians don't know really what the pharmacists are doing, and I don't even know if they care. They just want the outcome. They want good outcomes. They want the patients to be better, and they don't want any adverse effects of using the drug. Along the line with the nurses, we had to kind of tell them, look, these levels that we're drawing, since we decided to go to the Bayesian model, they're not all troughs. So we might draw a random level, and we found that probably now we draw way more random levels, especially random levels in the morning with the AM labs, and we use that instead of having to get a trough level, which many times we find that the drug got hung, and so that trough level wasn't appropriate anyways, and we had to go back and redraw it. So I think it's even a patient satisfier sometimes that we don't have to draw multiple times on these patients. But we have to relay the information to the prescribers and to the nurses that this level that maybe comes back at 22, really, that's not a trough. That isn't the trough level, and you're going to have to follow us and follow our notes to really understand what the level is. And probably one other point is with the AUC, we're seeing that we don't always have to have the higher trough levels. We get in that 400 to 600 level of the AUC, and that trough is lower than what we were doing before. And a lot of times we're using less drug.
Interesting. Really appreciate the level of feedback you guys just shared. We have a few questions, but before we get there, each of you, what's your key recommendation on this important topic? We've covered a lot of ground today. And what's your key takeaway for the audience? Jeff, I'll throw that to you to start.
I think what points that I wanted to say is you got to know where you're at, know your AKI, know how much Vanco you're using, know the days of therapy, and actually even know how much total Vanco you're using, because that'll all play into, which direction you might want to go with the application that you want to do the dosing. Go out there and try it. We stood back and we weren't really, I can say that we weren't going to look at a Bayesian modeling program. We were going to do a spreadsheet. That was just the way. We weren't going to worry about cost or anything, but we tried a couple different models, and we stepped back and we looked at our drug costs. We looked at how many levels we're going to do, because we knew we were going to have to do 2 levels with a spreadsheet. And so compare the costs of what you have there and try them and compare them and see which works best for your situation.
Yeah, really helpful. Julie, how about you?
Yes, I believe you really need a leader or a pharmacist champion responsible for implementation, protocol development, robust training, as well as doing constant feedback to see where you are and if things need to be changed, and also to be able to continue with maintenance training and upkeep of protocols, as well as training of new hires that come on after the process is implemented.
Great. Rita?
Well, I would echo the part about a pharmacy champion, but also remembering to recruit your stakeholders from the various disciplines and really looking at what is the important items for your leaders and trying to link your program back to those important issues for them and trying to have it make sense for you in order to try to sell the whole idea of being able to get the program to enhance the work for the pharmacist. So definitely tie it back to the patient safety, the reducing in times for staff to dig out all these important information and all. It's an important thing to do.
Yeah, really helpful. Sirj, before we jump to the questions, parting thought for the audience?
Yeah, I really strongly resonate with all of the recommendations that have been made, especially on the implementation side and identifying a clinical champion. One recommendation that I would have, sort of touched upon this earlier, is to really have a system and process in place to assess and track the extent of the AKI problem before introducing a new methodology or trying to make a process change. And so, whether you decide to stick to trough-based dosing or transition to AUC-based dosing, and if you decide to transition to AUC-based dosing, whether or not you decide to use a Bayesian software or not, Either or, it'll be important to set a baseline and then track clinical metrics over time to prove value at your institution as it relates to the approach that you decide to choose. So that would be my recommendation, is to really think through the process of collecting the right metrics, especially AKI, to prove value at your institution.
Yep, really helpful. I want to hit a few questions before we tie off here with Michael at Fierce. The guidelines recommend AUC-guided dosing for patients with suspected or definitive serious MRSA. Does this mean we should not use AUC-guided dosing for patients who are on vancomycin for other reasons, such as broad empiric antimicrobial coverage? And I'll throw that out to maybe Jeff, Julie, Rita, Sirj, whoever would like to tackle that one.
This is Jeff. I can tell you where we go. I don't think the evidence is out there yet outside of Staph aureus, so I don't know if we can totally incorporate it, but we have been using it when we can. But most of our use is for Staph aureus use, so it has been following it. We have used it for some enterococcus situations, but most of the cases are for Staph aureus.
Okay.
Yes, I can make a comment on that as well. At a high level, I think it's important to recognize that the guidelines cannot be broadly applied just yet, right? It's limited to Staph aureus infection. So going back to implementation, I think it is important to have the right practices in place to handle special populations like, patients with skin and soft tissue infection, patients with meningitis. Understanding really when to apply AUC-based dosing, I think is very important. Longer term, we believe that having, as I mentioned, the right underlying data will serve to bridge some of this knowledge gap. And specifically, we address this in two ways. First is through research that we decide to do with different institutions. With the large amounts of data that we collect, which includes pharmacokinetic data, we can start to assess whether the AUC target, for example, of 400 to 600 is appropriate for these special populations. I think that's a very big question that needs to be answered. And then secondly, with the right data, we can even inform model updates, right? We can use the data to validate and improve the underlying pharmacokinetic models and attempt at making them more broadly applicable. So to summarize, I would really suggest to recognize the limitations, create your clinical protocols accordingly, collect and use the data to determine appropriate targets and update PK models to improve target attainment.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, actually. And just to add on to from the pediatric or neonatal perspective, for example, Staph aureus is actually not the most common organism. Staph epidermidis is the most common organism in the neonatal population. And even in the guidelines, it will tell you that there's not enough data to suggest using the same AUCs, for example, to dose vancomycin for neonates with Staph epidermidis. So I do agree with Sirj that having some the Bayesian model to help collect some of this information will be helpful in trying to guide us in how do you dose these patients in the different disease states or different organisms. In this case, in the neonates with Staph epidermidis, aiming, most people would say we want to aim for lower doses. We don't want to be as aggressive, and also don't want to cause AKI in patients whose renal function is already much more reduced compared to the adults.
Yeah, thank you. Well, look, guys, that was great discussion. Michael, I'm going to turn it back over to you and really thank everyone for joining. Thank our panelists. Thank Fierce for hosting today. It's been a great discussion. There's some questions we didn't get to. We'll follow up with you, but Michael, back to you.
All right, thanks, Dan. And thank you for attending this Fierce Healthcare webinar and submitting so many great questions. I'd like to thank our speakers for participating and InsightRX for presenting today's webinar. This webinar has been recorded. You'll be able to access the recording within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.